Imagine waking each day to a life defined by toil, uncertainty, and the relentless demands of survival, where rest was a rare luxury and every decision could mean life or death. In medieval Europe, peasants lived under the weight of both the land and the lords who controlled it, their days measured by the rising and setting of the sun, their nights brief and often uncomfortable. They were the backbone of society, yet their lives were largely invisible to history. Tonight, we step softly into that quiet, grueling world, tracing the slow rhythms, small victories, and harsh realities of what it truly meant to be a medieval peasant. For centuries, one English king has been the villain of history, a hunchbacked tyrant who murdered his own nephews. But what if the story we've been told is completely wrong? What if the truth was buried for over 500 years, waiting to be found in the most unlikely of places? Today, we're uncovering the incredible story of Richard III, his life, his death, and his astonishing rediscovery. Richard Plantagenet was born in 1452, the youngest son in a powerful family fighting for the English throne in a brutal civil war, known as the Wars of the Roses. He grew up in a world of constant conflict and shifting loyalties. As a young man, he became the Duke of Gloucester and proved to be a loyal and capable supporter of his older brother, King Edward IV. Richard was a skilled military commander and a respected administrator, particularly in the north of England, where he was known for his sense of justice. He was wealthy, powerful, and, by all contemporary accounts, a very pious man. There was little to suggest he would one day become one of history's most infamous characters. Everything changed in April 1483, when King Edward IV died suddenly. His son, also named Edward, was just 12 years old and became King Edward V. Before his death, the king had named his brother Richard as Lord Protector, tasking him with governing the kingdom until the young king came of age. This is where the story takes a dark and mysterious turn. Richard intercepted the young king on his way to London, taking him into his protection and lodging him in the Tower of London. The boy's younger brother, also named Richard, soon joined him there. Then, a bombshell. A priest came forward and claimed that King Edward IV's marriage to the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was invalid. He alleged that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry another woman, which, in the eyes of the church, meant his later marriage was bigamous and his children illegitimate. With the two young princes declared illegitimate, the line of succession fell to the next person in line, their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In June 1483, just a couple of months after his brother's death, Richard was crowned King Richard III. The two young princes, now known to history as the Princes in the Tower, were seen less and less frequently. By the end of that summer, they had vanished completely. Their fate remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in English history. Did Richard have them murdered to secure his own throne? This is the version of events that has dominated for centuries, largely thanks to one man, William Shakespeare. His play, Richard III, written over 100 years later during the reign of the Tudor dynasty, who had defeated Richard, painted him as a monstrous, power-hungry villain. Shakespeare's Richard is a physically deformed and morally corrupt schemer who stops at nothing to get the crown. This powerful piece of propaganda has defined Richard's image ever since. Richard's reign, however, was short and troubled. Just 2 years after taking the throne, he faced a major challenge from a rival claimant, Henry Tudor, on August 22, 1485. Their armies met at the Battle of Bosworth Field. The battle was fierce, and accounts say Richard fought bravely, leading a cavalry charge deep into the enemy ranks in a desperate attempt to strike down Henry Tudor himself. But he was unhorsed, surrounded, and killed. He was the last English king to die in battle. After the battle, Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII, founding the famous Tudor dynasty. Richard's body, according to historical sources, was stripped, slung over a horse, and taken to the nearby town of Leicester, where it was put on public display before being buried in a friary church called Greyfriars. And that's where the story should have ended. The friary was destroyed during the Reformation in the 1530s, and over the centuries, its exact location was lost. The grave of the last Plantagenet king vanished. Legends grew that his body had been dug up and thrown into the nearby River Soar. Richard III was gone, leaving only his villainous reputation behind. Fast forward nearly 527 years to 2012. A group of historians and archaeologists, led by a passionate screenwriter named Philippa Langley, were convinced they could find the lost king. They focused their search on a very specific, and frankly, very mundane location in the city of Leicester, a council car park. Based on old maps and historical records, they believed the Greyfriars Church, and Richard's grave, lay right beneath the asphalt. It was a long shot, a needle in a haystack search that many experts thought was a waste of time. On the very first day of the dig, they hit something, a human skeleton. It was found in a hastily dug, irregularly shaped grave that was actually too short for the body. The skeleton was that of a male, and the spine showed a severe. This wasn't the hunchback of Shakespeare's imagination, but a real medical condition that would have made one shoulder appear higher than the other. Could this be him? The excitement was immense, but they needed proof. Scientists got to work. They noted the body had suffered multiple horrific injuries. There were at least 10 wounds, 8 of them to the skull. These weren't battle injuries sustained while wearing a helmet. They were humiliation injuries, inflicted after his helmet had been lost or removed. One fatal blow had sliced off the back of the skull, while another weapon had been thrust up through the base of the skull, deep into the brain. This brutal end matched the historical accounts of his death at Bosworth. The final piece of the puzzle came from DNA. Scientists were able to extract DNA from the skeleton's teeth. They then tracked down to modern-day descendants of Richard's eldest sister, Anne of York. One was a Canadian-born furniture maker named Michael Ibsen. The other wished to remain anonymous. In a moment that sent shockwaves around the world, the mitochondrial DNA matched. There was no doubt. The skeleton found under the car park was, against all odds, King Richard III. The discovery was monumental. It allowed us to see the real man, not the caricature. His scoliosis was severe, but he wasn't a hunchback. He was a battle-hardened warrior who stood about 5 feet 8 inches tall, which was average for the time. He had a slender, almost graceful build, despite his spinal condition. This was a man who could wear a full suit of armor and lead a cavalry charge. But what about the biggest question of all? Was he a murderer? Did he kill the princes in the tower? The discovery of his body doesn't give us a direct answer. It does, however, encourage us to look again at the evidence. We now know that the Tudors, who defeated him, had every reason to blacken his name to legitimize their own shaky claim to the throne. The story of the evil, deformed usurper was the ultimate piece of political propaganda. Modern historians are still divided. Some argue that the circumstantial evidence against Richard is overwhelming. The boys were in his care. They disappeared, and he had the most to gain. Others, often called Ricardians, argued that other people had motives too. Could it have been Henry Tudor, who had the boys killed after he took the throne to eliminate any rival claimants? Or perhaps the ambitious Duke of Buckingham? We may never know for sure. What the discovery in the Leicester car park did was give Richard III something he was denied for over 5 centuries. A voice. It replaced the monster of myth with a real, complex human being. In 2015, the remains of King Richard III were reburied, with the honor and ceremony befitting a king, in Leicester Cathedral, just a stone's throw from where he was found. The man who was lost to history had finally come home. His story is a powerful reminder that history is often written by the victors, and the truth can sometimes lie buried, waiting for centuries to be unearthed. When the excavations began in Leicester, no one expected certainty. Archaeologists are trained to hope quietly. They uncover fragments, suggestions, partial truths. The ground beneath the old Greyfriars site had been disturbed many times, pipes laid, buildings demolished, asphalt poured. If anything remained of Richard III, it would be broken, scattered, or lost entirely. Yet slowly, layer by layer, the past revealed itself. Beneath modern debris lay medieval foundations. Beneath those, disturbed earth. And then, unexpectedly, a human skeleton. It was not laid flat like a careful burial. The body rested awkwardly, the spine curved unnaturally, the head tilted. The grave was narrow, hurried. There was no coffin, no shroud pins, no royal marker. Whoever buried this person had done so quickly, without ceremony, as if eager to finish and move on. From the beginning, something felt different. The skeleton showed clear signs of scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine. Not a hunchback, as Shakespeare had later described, but a noticeable asymmetry that would have caused one shoulder to sit higher than the other. This alone caught attention. Historical descriptions of Richard mentioned uneven shoulders. For the first time, legend and bone began to align. The skull bore wounds. Not 1 or 2, but multiple injuries consistent with battle. Sharp force trauma from bladed weapons. Cuts to the jaw, the back of the head, the crown. One injury suggested the helmet had been removed or lost, exposing the skull to fatal blows. There were no defensive wounds on the arms. This mattered. It suggested the final strikes came when the man was already incapacitated, perhaps kneeling, perhaps fallen. Medieval chroniclers wrote that Richard fought bravely, surrounded by enemies, refusing to flee. The skeleton echoed that story silently, without drama. Carbon dating placed the remains in the correct century. The age at death matched Richard's, the height matched, the injuries matched. Still, archaeology demands restraint. Coincidence must always be ruled out. Then came the DNA. Researchers traced mitochondrial DNA through the maternal line, a slow, careful process stretching across centuries. Living descendants of Richard's sister were located. Their genetic material matched that taken from the bones. At that moment, speculation ended. The king beneath the parking lot had a name. Richard III had been found. News spread quickly, but not loudly. There were no shouts of triumph, only a quiet sense of astonishment. A man debated for centuries had finally returned to the physical world. He was no longer just a character in plays or textbooks. He was bone, scar, and silence. With the skeleton came questions. Did this discovery change who Richard was? Historians revisited old accusations. Tudor writers had every reason to vilify him. Henry VII, who defeated Richard, founded a dynasty that needed justification. Portraying the fallen king as monstrous made victory feel righteous. Shakespeare later inherited those narratives, shaping them into unforgettable drama. Crooked body, crooked soul. It was poetry, not evidence. The skeleton told a quieter story. Yes, Richard had scoliosis, but he was physically capable of fighting, riding, and leading troops. His body was not deformed beyond function. He lived actively, aggressively, until death. The wounds showed courage, not cowardice. The burial showed humiliation, not honor. It suggested that after death, he was treated not as a king but as a defeated enemy, stripped, displayed, and buried quickly to prevent rebellion. This aligned with historical accounts of his body being shown publicly after Bosworth. In death, Richard lost control of his story. In rediscovery, he began to regain it. The debate over the princes did not end. Bones cannot speak of political choices, yet the skeleton forced historians to slow down, to separate fact from propaganda, to recognize how easily power shapes memory. Richard's short reign was examined again. Legal reforms once dismissed were reassessed. His popularity in the north was taken seriously. Petitions written in his favor were no longer ignored as anomalies. History did not flip suddenly, it softened. Richard was no longer simply villain or victim. He became what most people in history are: complicated. The reburial itself became another chapter. Where should a king rest? Some argued Westminster Abbey, others insisted Leicester, where he was found. Arguments echoed medieval disputes, though carried out through press conferences instead of swords. In the end, Richard was reburied in Leicester Cathedral, not far from where he had been discovered. The ceremony was formal, measured, and intentionally calm. No attempt was made to rewrite history dramatically, only to acknowledge it. The tomb was simple. No grand statue looming over visitors, no aggressive posture, just a quiet space, asking people to consider the weight of time. Visitors now walk past the graves slowly. Some pause longer than expected. They do not always know why. Perhaps it is because Richard III reminds us how fragile reputation is, how centuries of certainty can be unsettled by a few inches of earth being removed. For 500 years, England told itself a story about a king. Then the ground answered back, and it did not shout. It merely lay there, waiting to be noticed. After the reburial, something unusual began to happen. The story of Richard III did not end with the confirmation of his identity. Instead, it widened. Historians, archaeologists, and ordinary visitors started to look not only at the king himself, but at the long silence that had surrounded him. For centuries, Richard existed mostly in words, chronicles written by political rivals, plays written for entertainment, and textbooks repeating both. Now there was a body, and a body changes how people think. It slows judgment. Bone feels more permanent than opinion. Researchers examined every detail carefully. The spine showed a pronounced curve, yet the leg bones were strong and balanced. This meant he would not have limped. He would have stood slightly uneven, but moved confidently. Armor could easily conceal the difference. The terrifying twisted figure described in later literature no longer fit comfortably with physical evidence. The skull revealed something else, his face. Through facial reconstruction, specialists rebuilt muscle layer by layer, guided by anatomical depth markers. Gradually, a human expression emerged, not exaggerated, not monstrous, a young man with fine features and a steady gaze. The kind of face that might pass unnoticed in a crowd, if not attached to a crown. This image unsettled people more than any accusation ever had. Villains are easier to understand when they look like villains. Richard did not. Attention then turned back to his life before kingship, the long northern years he governed. Administrative records survived, land disputes settled, theft cases judged, property returned to small landholders. Petitions addressed to him used words like fair and quick. Medieval bureaucracy rarely preserved compliments unless they were genuine, because writing itself cost effort. Why, then, did his reputation collapse so completely? The answer lay in what came after Bosworth. Henry VII needed stability. England had endured decades of civil war. The new king could not afford lingering sympathy for his predecessor. The easiest way to close the past was to darken it, to make Richard seem not merely defeated but dangerous. If the former king had been cruel, then removing him became not rebellion but rescue. Writers working under Tudor rule shaped memory, gently but persistently. Each retelling smoothed away doubt. Over decades, repetition turned suggestion into certainty. By the time Shakespeare wrote his famous play, more than a century later, the story was already formed. The playwright did not invent the villain, he perfected it. Theatre requires clarity, and Richard became the embodiment of ambition itself, a symbol rather than a person. The skeleton complicated that symbol. It did not prove innocence. It did not solve the prince's disappearance, but it removed exaggeration. And once exaggeration fades, people begin to question everything built upon it. Even the Battle of Bosworth was reconsidered. Contemporary reports described Richard charging directly toward Henry Tudor, cutting through defenders in a final attempt to end the war in a single strike. The wounds on the skull supported close combat, not retreat. One injury at the back of the head likely came after his helmet was lost, meaning he remained fighting even after protection failed. This detail changed tone more than facts. Instead of a tyrant falling while fleeing, it suggested a king making one last deliberate decision to end conflict quickly, even at personal risk. Medieval kingship valued visible courage. A ruler was expected to share danger, not command from safety. Richard died fulfilling that expectation, whether wise or reckless. Visitors to Leicester Cathedral sometimes notice something subtle. The tomb does not attempt to declare him good or bad. It does not mention the princes. It does not defend or accuse. It simply marks a life and a death. Perhaps that restraint is appropriate. History often searches for conclusions, but people rarely provide them. Richard lived in a violent century where loyalty shifted and survival depended on speed of choice. Actions taken in urgency later appeared deliberate from distance. As research continued, even the diet of the king was studied through isotopes in the bones. In childhood he ate like a noble, rich in meat and freshwater fish. In adulthood, particularly near his reign, the diet became more luxurious, including expensive marine foods rarely available inland. These small details quietly confirmed his rise in status over time. Such information does not change politics, but it restores humanity. The man beneath the parking lot was not only a king at the end of his life, he had been a child, a brother, a husband, and a regional governor long before the crown touched his head. For most of his years, he lived outside the moment that defined him. And perhaps that is the strangest part of the discovery. The world remembered 2 years. The bones remembered 32. Slowly, the narrative surrounding Richard shifted from judgment to curiosity. Not was he evil, but who was he before everything went wrong? The question grew quieter, but deeper, because sometimes history does not change through new events. Sometimes it changes when the ground finally lets someone speak without words. As interest in Richard deepened, historians began to step even further back, away from the dramatic final years, and into the quieter structure of his everyday responsibilities. It became clear that most of his life had been spent not in pursuit of a crown, but in maintaining order in a difficult region of England. The north was not London. It was colder, less densely populated, and closer to the uncertain Scottish border. Raids, land feuds, and shifting loyalties were part of daily existence. A noble stationed there could not rule through distance. He had to be physically present, patient, and predictable. Richard spent years in this environment, developing habits very different from the court politics of the South. Documents from York and surrounding areas show his involvement in routine matters, property boundaries, inheritance disputes, trade disagreements, and protection of small tenants from larger landowners. None of this was dramatic enough for later storytellers to preserve, yet it shaped how ordinary people experienced authority. Stability, to medieval communities, was more valuable than spectacle. When Edward IV still lived, Richard rarely appeared at the center of national intrigue. He acted instead as reinforcement, the person sent where loyalty needed strengthening. His reputation in the north slowly grew less as a prince and more as a dependable judge. Even decades later, some petitions referenced past fairness, suggesting memory of his rulings endured after his death. This long period matters because it contrasts sharply with how quickly events unfolded in 1483, when Edward IV died. The kingdom did not collapse immediately. Preparations began for the coronation of young Edward V. Travel routes were organized. Households gathered, and officials coordinated movement toward London. Richard was called south to escort the boy king. At first, this followed expected tradition, a senior royal relative protecting the heir. But the political atmosphere had changed since earlier generations. Factions within the court feared losing influence during a minority reign. Advisors surrounding the young king held power simply by proximity. Others worried decisions would be made too quickly in the absence of experienced oversight. Richard intercepted the royal party on the road, arrested certain advisors, and assumed control of the king's protection. Later writers would interpret this moment as the first move in a calculated plan. Yet at the time, similar interventions had precedent during unstable successions. What made this one different was what followed. The princes were moved into the Tower of London, not unusual before a coronation, as it functioned both as fortress and royal residence. Weeks passed, discussions of legitimacy surfaced. A claim emerged that Edward IV's marriage had been invalid due to a prior betrothal, making his children ineligible for the throne. Parliament accepted this reasoning. Richard was offered the crown. Modern readers often search for a single decisive motive, but medieval politics rarely worked that way. Decisions grew from layers of fear, rumor, and urgency. England remembered civil war vividly. A disputed child king could reopen conflict immediately. Many nobles preferred an adult ruler, even if controversial, over uncertainty. Still, acceptance of the crown altered everything. Richard's reign began with attempts at reassurance. He traveled through regions, held public hearings, and issued legal reforms meant to show accessibility. Bail protections expanded. Some legal texts were translated into English so ordinary people could understand. Proceedings previously confined to Latin. These actions suggested an effort to legitimize authority through fairness rather than force. Yet overshadowing all governance was absence. The young princes were no longer seen. Silence created space for imagination. No announcement confirmed their deaths. No clear explanation described their location. Without information, rumors grew naturally. Opponents used uncertainty effectively. Supporters struggled to answer questions that had no public answer. Rebellions began to form around alternative claimants to the throne. Each uprising increased pressure on Richard's government and narrowed his time to establish stability. In a society accustomed to visible lineage, the uncertainty surrounding the heirs weakened confidence more than any policy could restore. Throughout this period, no record survives of Richard directly addressing the matter in detail. Whether this was strategy, inability, or simple lack of clear knowledge remains debated. But politically, silence proved costly. The kingdom drifted toward confrontation. Henry Tudor, living in exile for years, gathered support abroad. His claim to the throne was distant, but symbolically useful to those opposed to the current rule. Supporters did not always need certainty. They needed an alternative. By 1485, invasion became inevitable. The march toward Bosworth Field did not happen suddenly. It unfolded like gathering weather. Forces assembled, alliances hesitated, and loyalties balanced between caution and opportunity. For many nobles, the decision of which side to support would be made only when battle began. Richard moved to meet the threat, not as a ruler unfamiliar with war, but as someone who had lived among its rhythms since childhood. He organized defenses, gathered troops, and prepared for confrontation that would decide more than a crown. It would determine which version of England's past would be remembered. The fields waited quietly while two histories approached from opposite directions. And somewhere far from politics, the future grave beneath Leicester soil remained empty, not yet knowing it would soon hold a king, forgotten by the very kingdom he tried to steady. The morning of the battle arrived without ceremony. Medieval battles rarely began with speeches remembered for centuries. More often, they started with waiting long, quiet waiting as soldiers stood in damp grass, adjusting straps, checking weapons, and listening to distant movement carried by wind. Bosworth Field was not chosen for symbolism. It was chosen because armies met there. Richard's forces held the higher ground, a position that, in medieval warfare, often meant patience. A defensive advantage allowed time to observe the opposing army and the loyalties within it. Because at Bosworth, numbers alone did not decide the outcome. Many nobles present commanded their own retainers, and their commitment was uncertain until the last possible moment. Across the field stood Henry Tudor's army, smaller but unified by necessity. Henry himself was inexperienced in direct combat compared to Richard, yet he understood something essential. Victory did not require defeating the entire royal army. It required ending the king. Hours passed in tension rather than action. Scouts moved between positions. Messengers rode back and forth. Both sides watched the Stanley forces positioned nearby, powerful lords who had not yet chosen openly which banner to follow. Their decision would shape the battle more than swords would. Eventually, movement began. Archers fired first, arrows rising and falling in slow arcs that looked almost peaceful from a distance. Then infantry advanced, shields overlapping, pushing gradually toward contact. The sound was not a single crash but a growing pressure, metal striking wood, boots pressing mud deeper, voices blending into noise. Richard observed the shifting lines carefully. He could see Henry's position, guarded but not unreachable. The opportunity was narrow and dangerous, yet clear. Medieval kings were trained for moments exactly like this, decisive action that could end uncertainty immediately. He chose to charge. Gathering mounted knights around him, Richard rode directly toward Henry's standard. The movement surprised many watching. Instead of commanding from safety, he entered the densest part of the field. Accounts describe him striking down several opponents in rapid succession, advancing further than expected. For a brief time, it seemed the battle might end almost as soon as it began. But hesitation elsewhere changed everything. The Stanleys intervened, not gradually, but decisively, closing round Richard's advancing group. The king found himself separated from much of his army, surrounded not by a planned defense but by converging loyalties choosing their moment. What followed lasted minutes. The skeletal wounds discovered centuries later matched this stage. Multiple blows from different directions, concentrated around the head after his helmet was lost. No marks suggesting retreat, no signs of prolonged struggle on the limbs. It was sudden, chaotic, and final. Richard III died on the field. For the soldiers around him, the battle ended almost immediately. Once the king fell, organized resistance dissolved. Henry Tudor was proclaimed king among the noise of dispersing troops, his claim secured not by prolonged conquest, but by a single irreversible moment. Richard's body did not receive the careful attention given to royal dead in peaceful times. It was carried away quickly, transported to Leicester. Reports indicate it was displayed publicly to confirm death, a necessary act to prevent rumors of survival that might reignite conflict. The burial that followed reflected urgency rather than honor. He was interred in the Greyfriars Church, without elaborate ceremony. No grand tomb marked the location. The grave was modest, practical, and soon unremarkable. For those present, the future importance of the exact spot did not exist. England had a new king, and attention moved forward. Years passed, then decades. The monastery housing the grave was dissolved during religious reforms. Stones were removed, land repurposed, buildings dismantled. Memory faded gradually, not through decision but through replacement. Streets changed, foundations shifted, and eventually ordinary life covered the site completely. People walked above the grave daily, unaware. Meanwhile, the narrative of the fallen king began its transformation. Chroniclers under the new Tudor dynasty recorded events in ways that strengthened the legitimacy of the present ruler. Over time, stories sharpened. The missing princes became central. Physical descriptions grew harsher. Personality hardened into caricature. None of this required direct invention. Emphasis alone reshaped perception. Each retelling leaned slightly further until balance disappeared. By the time literature adopted the story, generations later, Richard had become less a person and more a warning, an example of ambition punished. The real burial place, lacking monument or memory, could not contradict the tale. Silence from the ground allowed imagination to dominate. Yet beneath that silence, The bones remained unchanged. The curved spine rested where it had fallen into earth. The skull fractures held their quiet testimony. Above, centuries moved, markets opened, buildings rose, vehicles eventually parked. The battle ended a reign in minutes. The forgetting took hundreds of years, and still, the soil kept its record, waiting without urgency for a time when someone would finally look down instead of forward. Centuries passed without interruption. The ground above the old Greyfriars site became part of ordinary life, and ordinary life rarely pauses to ask what lies beneath it. The monastery was dismantled stone by stone, its walls reused elsewhere, its memory fading into property boundaries and street names that no longer explained themselves. By the 17th century, people still believed Richard had been buried somewhere in Leicester, but no one agreed exactly where. Stories drifted. Some said the grave lay beneath a garden, others beneath a public building, and one persistent tale claimed his bones had been thrown into a nearby river. With each generation, certainty softened into rumor. Maps from the medieval period were imprecise, drawn more for direction than measurement. Over time, roads shifted slightly, construction altered foundations, and reference points disappeared. Even historians studying written records could only approximate the location of the lost friary, and so the king became a figure entirely made of narrative. His life was discussed in books, debated in lectures, and performed on stages. Students learned his name long before they learned where he rested. Without a grave, there was nothing physical to interrupt imagination. A man without a body becomes easier to reshape, yet interest in him never fully disappeared. In the 19th and 20th centuries, small groups of enthusiasts formed societies dedicated to re-examining his reign. They collected documents, compared chronicles, and argued that history had judged him too quickly. Their work was careful but limited. Without physical evidence, conclusions depended on interpretation. Still, one idea persisted quietly: if the friary could be located, perhaps the grave could too. Archaeology in urban environments is slow. Cities build over themselves repeatedly, and excavation requires permission, funding, and patience. For years, the idea remained theoretical. The modern city functioned normally, and beneath it lay layers too complex to explore casually. Eventually, detailed historical mapping began aligning old property records with modern streets. Scholars compared taxation lists, monastic accounts, and land transfers. Piece by piece, the approximate boundaries of Greyfriars emerged, not with certainty, but with reasonable confidence. The surprising conclusion pointed toward a modest parking area behind municipal buildings. It seemed almost too ordinary. A place where people left cars before work, where engines cooled in the evening air, where no plaque suggested significance. Yet historical measurements repeatedly converged there. Permission was granted for a small excavation. No one expected immediate success. Urban digs often reveal fragments, pottery shards, wall footings, scattered burials unrelated to famous individuals. The team prepared for careful documentation rather than discovery. When the asphalt was cut and removed, the first view was simply soil, compacted, layered, mixed by centuries of disturbance. Slowly, medieval surfaces appeared, stone alignments, floor remains, and traces of the friary church. Each find confirmed they were in the right place, even if the king himself remained uncertain. Then a grave was uncovered within what would have been the choir area of the church, a location consistent with a significant burial. The skeleton lay incomplete at first glance, compressed by later construction, yet largely intact. Its position lacked the neatness expected of ceremonial interment. Arms were not carefully folded. The body seemed placed quickly, the grave slightly too short, forcing curvature. The curved spine drew immediate attention, not dramatically bent forward, but distinctly uneven, a condition visible enough to be recognized in life, yet not debilitating. Researchers paused. Historical descriptions mentioned uneven shoulders. The possibility emerged quietly, without announcement. Further examination revealed battle injuries, sharp cuts to the skull, including one fatal wound at the base of the head. The pattern matched close combat rather than execution. Whoever this was had died violently, helmet removed or lost. Excavations continued cautiously. Every measurement was recorded, every fragment preserved. No conclusion was declared prematurely. Archaeology advances through patience, not excitement. Samples were taken for testing. Soil analysis, radiocarbon dating, and eventually DNA comparison began. Processes measured not in days but months. While waiting, The world above the site continued normally. Cars parked nearby. Pedestrians passed. Most people did not yet know history might be shifting quietly beneath their routine. When confirmation finally arrived, it did not come as spectacle. It came as agreement between multiple disciplines: genetics, osteology, historical alignment. Each result supported the same identity. The lost king had not vanished into river or legend. The confirmation did not create noise at first. It created stillness. For historians, the discovery meant that arguments once built only on texts now had a physical reference. The conversation changed tone. Instead of asking only what people had written about Richard, they could now ask what evidence remained from his own lifetime, untouched by later opinion. The skeleton was moved carefully to a laboratory, where examination took place slowly and deliberately. Each bone was studied individually before being understood as part of a whole life. The curvature of the spine was measured precisely. It showed adolescent onset scoliosis, a condition developing during growth, not from injury. This meant Richard had lived most of his life with a visible asymmetry, but without severe disability. His shoulders would have appeared uneven beneath clothing. Armor, structured and padded, could conceal it almost entirely. To those close to him, it would have been noticeable. Two soldiers across a battlefield, it would not. Attention turned to the skull again. The injuries revealed sequence. Some blows struck from above, suggesting attackers standing over him. One wound entered from the back, angled upward, consistent with the head lowered, perhaps after falling to one knee. Another cut sliced the cheek, likely delivered in close proximity during the final struggle. None of these injuries healed. They occurred at death. There were also small marks after death, thin cuts to bone that matched humiliation rather than combat. Medieval accounts describe the king's body being displayed publicly after the battle. The skeleton supported that detail quietly, without drama, confirming treatment meant to demonstrate finality. Researchers then examined teeth and bones for chemical signatures. Isotopes preserved traces of diet and environment across years. Childhood values matched Eastern England, consistent with his upbringing. Later values shifted northward, reflecting long residence there. Toward the end of life, the diet grew richer, more protein, more marine fish, foods associated with royalty. Even without records, the body described a life moving through geography and status. Facial reconstruction followed, but not as art, as anatomy. Layers of muscle depth were added using standard measurements, guided only by bone structure. The resulting face appeared calm, youthful, and unexpectedly ordinary. Not softened, not hardened, simply human. When the image was released, reaction was thoughtful rather than dramatic. People recognized something familiar, the difference between legend and presence. A real face leaves less room for exaggeration. Historians began revisiting written sources with renewed caution. Chroniclers writing under Tudor rule were reread line by line. Some details remained plausible. Others appeared shaped by purpose. Without accusing falsehood, scholars acknowledged perspective. The princes in the tower remained unanswered. The bones could not explain absence. Yet the discovery encouraged separation between proven events and inherited assumption. Richard's guilt was no longer automatic. It became a question again. Meanwhile, Leicester prepared for rebuttal plans, focused on dignity without spectacle. The aim was not to celebrate nor condemn, but to conclude uncertainty. The coffin was designed simply, made of English oak. Inside, the skeleton would rest in a natural position, supported and protected, no longer compressed by a hurried grave. Before burial, the remains lay in quiet display for public visitation. People queued, not out of fascination with royalty alone, but curiosity about time. They stood before a man who had lived in their country, yet been absent from physical memory for centuries. Some visitors stayed only seconds, others remained longer, reading inscriptions slowly. The atmosphere was closer to reflection than ceremony. During the reinterment, readings from historical texts were balanced, some critical, some sympathetic. No final judgment was pronounced. Instead, the service acknowledged uncertainty itself as part of history. The tomb in Leicester Cathedral was carved from pale stone, shaped in a clean, simple form. Light falls across it gently through high windows. Nothing about it demands emotion. It invites it quietly. Now, people who learn his name can stand above the place where he rests and understand that stories are not always fixed. A king once buried quickly in political urgency now lies in considered calm. The discovery did not transform Richard into hero or erase suspicion. it did something subtler. It restored proportion. He returned from symbol to person, a man shaped by war, loyalty, sudden power, and sudden loss. And in doing so, he changed not only how England remembered him, but how it remembered the certainty of its own history. After the reburial, attention shifted once more, not toward proving identity, but toward understanding consequence. The discovery of Richard III had not only uncovered a grave, it had revealed how easily memory can settle into comfort. For over 5 centuries, England had lived with a version of events that felt complete. Now completeness had become uncertainty again. Schools updated textbooks slowly, not by rewriting everything, but by softening statements once presented as facts. Where students had learned confident conclusions, they now learned questions. The change was subtle, almost gentle. Instead of removing the old narrative, historians placed it beside the new evidence and allowed both to exist together. Visitors continued to arrive in Leicester. Some expected drama, a villain's resting place, but found quietness instead. The cathedral did not instruct them how to feel. It offered space, light, and a name carved in stone. People spoke softly there, even children, as if aware that the story had already been loud enough for centuries. Researchers also returned to documents that had long seemed unimportant. Household records, payment lists, and correspondence preserved by accident rather than intention. These sources lacked grand claims, which made them valuable. They described routine, wages paid on time, repairs ordered, supplies distributed. Patterns suggested a ruler attentive to administration. None of this proved moral character, but it suggested competence. Competence rarely survives in legend. Drama replaces it. Yet in government, competence shapes daily life far more than personality. For people living in the north during Richard's years as Duke, stability would have mattered more than reputation. Meanwhile, interest grew beyond academic circles. The public followed the story, not as a tale of kingship alone, but as a reminder that history can remain unfinished. The idea that a parking lot could hold a missing monarch altered perception of the ordinary. Any familiar place might carry forgotten layers beneath it. The excavation also influenced archaeology itself. Urban exploration gained renewed appreciation. Cities were no longer obstacles to history, but containers of it. Careful work in small spaces could reshape national narratives. Even literature responded. Modern writers portrayed Richard with greater complexity, neither absolved nor condemned automatically. Fiction allowed possibility where earlier works had demanded certainty. The character became human again, capable of doubt as well as decision. Debate over the princes continued quietly among scholars. The discovery did not close the question, but it changed the tone. Instead of arguing to defend or accuse, historians analyzed probability, political context, and available evidence with patience. The conversation became less about verdict and more about understanding medieval power. In the years following the discovery, anniversaries passed with modest ceremonies. Wreaths were placed, lectures given, and then life resumed. The king's presence became part of the city's rhythm rather than an interruption to it. And perhaps that was the final transformation. Richard III returned not to reclaim a throne, but to become ordinary again, a historical figure grounded in a real place, accessible to anyone willing to stand quietly and read a name. The distance between past and present shortened, not dramatically, but enough to feel. The parking spaces were gone, replaced by awareness. The ground no longer hid what it held. People walked there differently, conscious that time does not disappear. It accumulates. The skeleton had not spoken in words. It did not defend its owner. It did not accuse enemies. It simply existed, and existence proved powerful enough. By being found, it required everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew. History, it turned out, was less like a completed book, and more like a manuscript still being uncovered, page by page, layer by layer, sometimes in the most unremarkable places. And in that slow uncovering, Richard III's story continued. Not as a finished judgment, but as an ongoing conversation carried gently forward through time. After Richard III was reburied, something interesting happened. The world's attention shifted. The big question was no longer about proving his identity, but about understanding the consequences of finding him in the first place. For over 500 years, England had a version of Richard III that felt finished, complete. Suddenly, finding his skeleton under a parking lot turned that certainty back into a question. Schools started updating their textbooks, but not in the way you might think. They didn't just tear out the old pages and rewrite everything. Instead, they softened the language. Statements that were once presented as hard facts became inquiries. Where students used to learn confident conclusions, they now learned to ask questions. It was a subtle shift. The old narrative wasn't erased, it was just placed alongside the new evidence, allowing both to exist together. Meanwhile, Leicester became a destination. Tourists flocked to the city, many expecting to find a villain's dramatic resting place. But what they found was quietness. Leicester Cathedral didn't tell them how to feel. It simply offered space, light, and a name carved in stone. People naturally spoke in whispers there, even children, as if they knew the story had already been loud enough for centuries. Researchers also went back to their archives, but with a new perspective. They started looking at documents that had long been considered boring or unimportant, old household records, payment lists, and letters that were saved by accident, not by design. These documents didn't make any grand claims, and that's what made them so valuable. They described the routine of governance: wages paid on time, repairs ordered for castles, supplies distributed to the army. A pattern began to emerge, suggesting a ruler who was actually very attentive to the details of administration. Now, none of this proved he was a good person. It didn't absolve him of the accusations against him, but it did suggest competence. And competence is something that rarely survives in a legend. Legends prefer drama, heroes, and villains. But in the day-to-day running of a country, competence is what truly shapes people's lives, far more than a leader's personality. For the people living in the north of England during Richard's time as a duke, his ability to provide stability would have mattered much more than his reputation in London. The story captivated people far beyond academic circles. The public followed every development, not just as a tale about a long-lost king, but as a powerful reminder that history is never really finished. The idea that a monarch could be found under a city council parking lot completely changed how people saw the world around them. It made them wonder what other forgotten layers of history might be hiding just beneath the surface of their own ordinary towns and cities. The discovery also had a huge impact on archaeology itself. It sparked a renewed appreciation for urban exploration. Cities were no longer seen as just modern obstacles built on top of history. They were seen as containers of it. The project proved that careful, meticulous work in small, overlooked spaces could completely reshape a national narrative. Even literature and art began to respond. Modern writers and playwrights started portraying Richard with far more complexity. He was no longer automatically a monster or a saint. Fiction began to explore the possibilities and the grey areas where earlier works had demanded black and white certainty. The character became human again, a man capable of doubt and pressure, not just cold, calculated decisions. Of course, the debate over the princes in the tower didn't just stop. It continued quietly among scholars, but the tone had changed. Instead of arguing to defend or accuse Richard, brilliance started analyzing probabilities, looking at the political context, and patiently sifting through the available evidence. The conversation became less about reaching a final verdict and more about understanding the brutal realities of medieval power. It was a more nuanced, more thoughtful discussion. In the years that followed the discovery, anniversaries of the find came and went with modest ceremonies. Wreaths were laid, lectures were given, and then life in Leicester would resume its normal rhythm. The king's presence had become a part of the city's fabric, not an interruption to it. He was no longer a ghost haunting the history books, but a real part of the local landscape. And maybe that was the biggest transformation of all. Richard III didn't return from the grave to reclaim his throne or his reputation. He returned to become ordinary again. He became a historical figure grounded in a real place. A person whose story was accessible to anyone willing to stand quietly for a moment and read his name on a stone. The vast distance between the past and the present suddenly felt shorter, not in a dramatic, flashy way, but just enough to feel real. The parking spaces over his grave are gone now, replaced by a sense of awareness. The ground no longer hides what it holds. People walk over that spot differently today, conscious that time doesn't just disappear. It accumulates, layer upon layer, right beneath our feet. The skeleton itself never spoke a word. It didn't defend its owner. It didn't accuse his enemies. It simply existed, and its existence proved to be powerful enough. By being found, it forced everyone to stop and reconsider what they thought they knew about one of the most famous figures in English history. It turns out that history is less like a finished book on a shelf, and more like a manuscript that is still being uncovered page by page, layer by layer, often in the most unremarkable of places. And in that slow, patient uncovering, Richard III's story continues. It's not a finished judgment passed down through the ages, but an ongoing conversation carried gently forward through time. For centuries, the final resting place of King Richard III, the last English king to die in battle, was a complete mystery. After his defeat at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, historical records simply said he was buried in Leicester. But where exactly? The trail went cold for over 500 years, leaving a gaping hole in one of England's most dramatic royal stories. Many believed his body was unceremoniously thrown into the River Soar, lost to time forever. But one historian, Philippa Langley, refused to give up. She was convinced the king wasn't lost, just misplaced. Driven by what she called a gut feeling, she launched the Looking for Richard project. Her research led her to a very specific and rather unglamorous location, a city council car park in Leicester. It sounds unbelievable, right? Digging for a medieval king under a modern parking lot. Many people thought she was chasing a ghost. In 2012, the archaeological dig began, and on the very first day, they found something incredible. A human skeleton. But was it him? The skeleton showed signs of a violent death, consistent with battle wounds. Most tellingly, it had severe scoliosis, curved spine which perfectly matched historical descriptions of Richard III's physical deformity, often exaggerated by his enemies into a hunchback. The evidence was compelling, but they needed definitive proof. Scientists extracted DNA from the skeleton and compared it with that of two living descendants of Richard's eldest sister, Anne of York. The result? A perfect match. The skeleton in the car park was, without a doubt, King Richard III. This incredible discovery rewrote history. It gave a face and a physical reality to a king, often seen as a villain in a Shakespeare play. The find not only solved a 500-year-old mystery, but also sparked a global conversation about Richard's true character and legacy. From a forgotten grave under tarmac to a grand reburial in Leicester Cathedral, the king had finally been found. It's a powerful reminder that history is often hidden right beneath our feet, just waiting for someone with enough passion and determination to look. Thanks for watching, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more historical deep dives.